How many of you guys are pastors or work in ministry leadership at a church? Majority, okay. How many of you guys would say that you are in a church that you would classify in an urban area? Okay, slightly smaller. How many of you would say that your church is in a suburban area? Okay, all right, excellent. That's all helpful. So, like he said, my name is Keelan Cook. The reason that I would be talking to you guys about this stuff, I work at Southeastern Seminary as the Urban Resource Coordinator. That's a big fancy title they gave me that doesn't mean much, except my job is to think through how we do the Great Commission, how we do missions in cities, and to then turn around and help people create and craft resources so that they can do that kind of stuff. So I think about cities a lot. I do this on a national level. So the stuff that we're going to be talking about today, this is all trends. What I want you to hear is, I've researched this, but I am no expert in Houston. You guys are the experts in Houston, not me. Okay? So what you're going to see, I'm going to try to give you guys the broad brushstrokes of how things are going in cities in the United States. Much of this, you may go, oh, that describes what's going on in Houston. But there's pieces of it that you may say, that doesn't really fit here. And what I want to do is leave you guys with information from kind of the national level so that you're in a position to let that dialogue with what you know as experts about your own city so that it may be able to enhance what you're doing here. That's really kind of the goal today is for us to be able to do that. The way I want to do it, I'm going to try to answer 4 questions, or at least talk about 4 questions in a way where we have some categories and some parameters that come out of that. The first question, of course, is what is urban? I think we need to do a little clarification on that issue. So what is urban? The next question is what caused urban? There's a lot of information that I think we can gain in working in cities if we look at how they've developed in the U.S. I'm not going to do how they've developed in the globe. That's a very long conversation that happened over thousands of years. We're just going to focus on the U.S. over the last 100. But I'm going to try to give you guys a real quick bullet point of what's gone on to get us to where we are. But then the next question is, where are we now, right? So what do our cities look like now? What is this context that we're trying to reach so that we can then answer the question of what our mission to this context is? So those are our 4 questions, right? What is urban? What caused urban? Where are we now? And what is our mission? Those are the 4 things that we're going to try to run through today in order to do that. And to start, I want us to focus on this quote by Tim Keller. I think it sums up some of the significance of why we even need to be having this conversation. I'm preaching to the choir here. You came to a seminar on urban, so I think y'all get this. But because the world is on its way to becoming 70% urban, and that is not an exaggeration, by the way. The world is, in fact, on its way to becoming 70% urban. 2008, 2009, right in there, we hit a tipping point. Demographers, sociologists, people of that nature refer to it as the dawn of the urban millennium. So for the first time in global history, world history, we actually had more people living in cities than we had living outside of cities. And that trend is not changing. If anything, it is accelerating. And because it's accelerating, it means that we are quickly approaching a world where 70% and plus of global citizens are city dwellers. Because of that, we all need a theological vision that is distinctly urban. Now, I want to draw your attention to a word there, theological vision. One of the things that happens a lot in conversations and a lot of the resources and research that I cull through when it comes to urban discussion, it's really pragmatic discussion. It's conversations about demographics. It's conversations about market trends. It's conversations about real estate. And these things are all important. I do think that we need to take a good look at what our cities and their culture looks like. But our mission is a distinctly theological mission. I'm a missiologist. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not an urban planner. I'm not an architect. I'm not an engineer. And I'm not an economic guru of some form. That's not what I do. I'm a missiologist. So what I am concerned with is a theological vision for how to reach our cities. Ultimately, what does the Bible say about our responsibility as the church to cities? That's the thing that we need to be able to have a unique conversation about as churches. even if you don't go to the city to minister. Make no mistake, the city is coming to you. Keller makes a good point here. And so, I think that leads us just into our next conversation here. First question, what is urban? This word gets tossed around like a frisbee nowadays, right? You see it as, it's an adjective, primarily. It's getting used as a noun now. It's also getting used as a verb and all kinds of other figures of speech. But it's a word that is a modifier or something that describes something. And this is where we really get sideways when we start talking about urban anything. Because a modifier has meaning that it describes, right? So when you say something is urban, you're attributing qualities to that thing. And because the word gets used so much as an adjective to describe so many things now, we've shoveled all kinds of meaning into that word that sometimes not even really attached to it. Or if it is, it's only tangentially so. And what that causes us to do is this weird thing where simultaneously we'll make more things urban than are, or we'll use that word in a way that's narrow enough that it cuts off pieces of things that are urban. I'll give you some examples. So here's what it's not. Urban is not black. Urban is not poor. Urban is not liberal. And urban is not trendy. Now let me explain what I mean by all this. Urban has aspects of every one of these. But when we start using that word as an adjective for any of these, we've cut off valuable pieces of its meaning. There's a lot of reasons in historical stuff that causes us to load the word with some of these meanings. So when we had the decentralization that I'll talk about in a second, where the suburbs exploded and white flight happened and all this other stuff occurred, we crafted a term called the inner city, right? And you guys all know what inner city means. Inner city is that area where a bunch of poor people, typically minorities, live, and then you've got the suburban ring where the middle class lives. And urban started meaning black, and it started meaning poor. But that's not what urban means. Urban has a much broader connotation than that. Just like to call all white people suburban, clearly we know that doesn't fit, right? To call all black people urban, that doesn't fit either. That's unhelpful for everyone. And what it does is it causes us to focus on one aspect of ministry in a setting where there are myriad other pockets of people and demographics that are also necessary to hit. So in the urban core, you've got all kinds of different people. And using any of these as equal to the term urban limits its scope. So what we need to do is we need to realize that it is a broader term than any of the ways that we have been using it in the past. A lot of places talk about urban ministry, and what they mean is social justice ministry to minorities in poor areas. That's not urban ministry. That is a kind of urban ministry, but that's not the totality of it. And a lot of young millennials nowadays, for them the term urban is quite the reverse. It's trendy, it's fashionable, it's where I get to go wear my skinny jeans and drink my craft coffee and hang out in these new hipster sections of town and eat at Chipotle, right? Like that's the new urban in the minds of young people nowadays. And so when they hear urban, they think urban's where I want to be and I want to go off into this gentrified neighborhood. They don't call it gentrified, they'll use the term revitalized because that sounds better, right? And I want to go live off in this revitalized neighborhood over here and be all cool and get out of the disenfranchised suburbs and move back into the center. But the problem with that view is that it misses the fact that there is a lot of minority neighborhoods. There's a lot of areas that are now being displaced by that very gentrification they're doing. And it's causing real needs. So if you define it in either direction, you miss big pieces of what we need to do to actually take care of our mission as a church, our responsibility as a church into those cities. So we need to be careful about what we throw the term urban on top of. Another piece of the conversation here, is urban a place or is it a people? This one in academic circles goes round and round and round and round. And it really depends on who you ask. If you ask a sociologist, it's people. But why is that? It's because they study people. So in their mind, an urban system is the group of people that all live around each other and how they interact and relate with each other in human systems. That's what a sociologist will tell you urban means. Now, an urban planner or a city planner, they're going to tell you quite the reverse. They're going to tell you it's the space that is urban. So urban is a place for these people. In their mind, the way you build the space is what causes the people to interact in a certain way, right? So all of a sudden, this urban planner sets up what they want to call an urban environment. And so it's a pedestrian environment primarily. It's going to have mixed zoning. So you'll have a multi-purpose building that the first floor is stores, the second and third floors are apartment complexes. So that's what they mean by urban, like I said, an urban planner, a city planner, that's what they're referring to. And in their mind, what that does is it causes the social interaction because the physical space determines how people interact with one another. So that's the way that they're going to run with it. Now, an economist, and I didn't include this in the actual question there, they think of it as a system of commerce. So it's not people, it's not place. It's the system that's of commerce that's generated. So it's businesses. And it's these businesses that all pool together and they come together so that they can network and they can use each other to develop their products. And they generate revenue. And it's really that commerce that causes people to come to the cities and causes us to have to develop the space. Now, which one is it? I think it's best to take a holistic view on this one. Because remember, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an urban planner, I'm not an economist, right? My job is a missiologist. So what do I need to understand about the place? Have a holistic view. If you're reading materials on urban, what is urban? Urbanization and urbanism, which are actually two different things. But if you're reading materials on that, consider it from this perspective. It is a place, but it's a place with people. And it generates commerce, and it generates culture. Now, if you'll notice, I don't have the word diverse in there. It probably should be. A very quick definition that a lot of missiologists are using nowadays for urban is density and diversity. Density and diversity. Two good words to throw down when we're talking about urban. So urban doesn't mean black, it doesn't mean trendy, it doesn't mean liberal, but it does mean dense. And it does mean diverse. The reason I didn't stick diverse in this particular definition, though, to be clear, in the United States, every urban area that I've ever looked at is rather diverse ethnically. However, that is not true globally. Tokyo is not very ethnically diverse. However, if we expand our definition of diverse past just the color of skin, even Tokyo is diverse. Because there's all kinds of different jobs in Tokyo. There's all kinds of different income levels in Tokyo. There's all kinds of different habits and traditions and even religions. So when you expand the term diverse past the way we tend to see it in American eyes, cities are both dense and they are diverse. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about an urban area. We need to get our frame right on this one because that's going to then allow us to think through what is this urban area that we're trying to minister to and how do we minister to that area. Those are the next two things we need to think through, right? But consider it is a place that has got a ton of people, and because it has a ton of people, it creates diversity, it creates commerce, and it creates culture. It becomes an engine for commerce and an engine for culture. It starts spitting that stuff out to the world around it. It makes them very influential places. Houston, of course, is a prime example of that. And you guys, I don't even need to get into the details of why that is. You guys understand that intuitively. So, next question here. What caused urban? So if we're going to shift from kind of what is this, it's these places of density and diversity. They've got all kinds of different people. They've got all kinds of different cultures and economic levels. They've got all kinds of different religions. They create commerce. They create culture. This is what it is. But where in the world did it come from? Now, here in the United States, we have a very interesting history of urbanization because we started, then we stopped and reversed, and then we started again. That's not the way it worked in most other places in the world. We've got a really unique situation where we urbanized earlier than most places in the world, but then we stopped and we de-urbanized, and we spread way out. And only now, in the last 15 years or so, has that trend changed. and we're finally starting to move back into the cities. Let me go over some of the whys on that. And as we go through this presentation, you'll realize all of my slides look like they were drawn by a kindergartner with crayons, because I drew them. So, give me a second here. Let me pull up my thoughts on this one. 1900, that's where we're going to start this. Turn of the century is when the United States started urbanizing for the first time. Now, it started a little before this. Numbers are going to be fuzzy in this section. I just kind of attached a decade to it. So 1900, we had a boom in the U.S. And there were a couple of reasons that caused this. The first big one was industrialization. So if you guys know anything about history, we had that whole industrial revolution. All of a sudden, we start mass producing stuff. And as we did that, that really gained traction in the U.S. And we started moving from an agrarian economy, where everybody was a farmer, to an industrial economy, where the majority of people worked in factories. Well, what that meant is everybody doesn't need 1,000 acres anymore. Everybody needs to be close to a factory. That was the primary driving engine for urbanization in the United States. Alongside of that, though, there were several other key factors. One of those was immigration. During this period, we had what is known as the first great wave of immigration in the United States. You guys have seen pictures of Ellis Island and the lines there, all of the immigration that occurred back during the turn of this century. It was huge. We had people coming in the droves from all over. Primarily, though, they were European peoples, primarily. So for the majority of them were Caucasian. The majority of them were coming from places with similar backgrounds to the Americans that had come a generation or two prior to, right? They were streaming in, though, and they came in and became primarily urban peoples off the bat. So we had all of our farmers moving into cities, and we had streaming immigrants coming over to the land of opportunity, right? This is why we got the Statue of Liberty. This is why France gave it to us. Because of this immigration that was coming in, and we were seen as this new land of opportunity, and so all these people were coming to find work in these cities. So what wound up happening is we had an urban explosion around this time. So easy example is Chicago I may get my numbers wrong here, it was sometime around between 1860 and 1880, right in that area. It had 4,000 residents. So this was right after it was started. It had 4,000 residents. By 1900, it had 1.5 million. That's how fast we were urbanizing. The same thing was happening in Manhattan. The same thing was happening in a lot of those big cities. By 1910, it had added another 1 million, by the way. So that's how fast it was growing. However, as we were doing this, we were sticking people on top of people, on top of people, on top of people. And we didn't know how to do that well yet. And so what wound up happening was congestion, unsafe living situations, and extreme pollution, which raises crime. And so the setting got kind of nasty. Nobody really wanted to live in it anymore. But this is where the jobs were. And so we were in this situation where the city became really unlivable, but we didn't know what to do about it. By 1920, our trend nationally shifted. In 1920, for the first time since our urbanization boom started, we had less people living in cities than the year before. This was a tipping point for us nationally. What happened? I'm going to give you a couple of things that really caused that. I've already told you about the unintended consequences that had occurred when we crammed in on top of each other during that industrial setting, right? Well, new technology paved a way for us to get out of the city. We had two things that happened. The first was the automobile. We were the first country to have cities grow up with the automobile as a piece of technology. It became a staple here quickly. And all of a sudden, for the first time in man's history, they could live somewhere different than they worked. That was huge. But the other thing was the development of mass-produced housing, single-family units, to be specific, mass-produced single-family units. The first suburb in the United States was just outside of New York City. It was called Levittown. It was named after the guy, Levitt, that invented the mass-produced, stick-built, single-family home. And he was able to put these things up every couple of days. And so he basically built an entire neighborhood, rapid pace, and everybody was able to have their own little plot of land. They were able to have their own little picket fence. They were able to have their own single-family unit. Now, in an era when everybody is reeling from congestion, and they're reeling from the pollution and living on top of each other and being crammed in these apartment complexes, this sounds like the answer to a prayer, does it not? All of a sudden, I've got the ability to live in my own home because it's cheap now. It doesn't have to be an estate out there anymore. Now they're mass-produced. So the middle class can afford a single-family unit, and I've got a car, which means I can get there, and then I can get back to my job that's going to allow me to pay for the house out here. 1920 is when the suburb became a possibility. And that changed the ballgame for the United States. All of a sudden, we had reasons to move out and ways and means to do so. So this starts occurring. We start decentralizing. These little suburbs start popping up around cities across the United States. The Sears Roebuck House, some of you guys may be familiar with that. You could order your own home out of a catalog, right? Yeah. And they'd come out and they'd build the thing for you. It was this whole philosophy that led to what we now call the American dream, right? This idea that I can have my own little plot of land with a 2-car garage and a white picket fence. This developed in the 20s, and as it did so, it started to bleed our cities out. However, it was not the only thing that affected the move of our cities. In addition to just the unlivable conditions that you find in a city setting back then, racial tensions were starting to run real high in the United States. They had been high since the Civil War. But of course, you take those tensions and you cram them into an urban setting. And as the civil rights movement started to move forward, those tensions just got higher and higher and higher. And white flight started happening in the 50s and 60s. All of a sudden, we had the means to be out in the suburbs, and now I have an emotional reason why I want to move out there, right? Yep. And so this trend, I mean, this was really a thing. White flight happened. If there's anybody here that thinks it didn't, you just got to go back and look at the numbers. And it's fascinating. In particular, there's a book that talks about the anti-urban bias in the United States. And it hits this issue in Atlanta specifically, and it shows some demographic. I can get you the materials in this book. It shows the demographic maps from year to year to year, black versus white, and the city just bled out as far as white people are concerned. And they just bled out into the rings. And that happened across the country. So what it leaves us with is this huge transition that starts happening from 1920 on, and then it just gets exacerbated in the 50s and 60s. Huge demographic shifts start occurring. Anybody that has the means to get out of the city starts to move out of the city. And as that happened, it leaves what we started calling an inner city ring. There was the outer city and the inner city. The outer city is where anybody that had the means to get out moved to. The inner city is the people that were left that couldn't, right? So that's what started to happen as far as the dynamic. It was much worse in certain cities than others, but across the board in the United States, this was a thing that developed, a transition that occurred. And as it was happening, evangelicalism, so let's switch rails here and not just talk about the country in general, but let's talk about us for a minute, right? We followed suit. To our chagrin, at least it should be to our chagrin, we were not countercultural on this issue. Not at all. Instead, we started to develop anti-urban theology. Around this time, and this wasn't just happening here, it was happening in Europe too, there was a trend of anti-urban theology. A man by the name of Jacques Ellul is a good example of it. He was in France, but his stuff got adapted here in the United States. And so all of a sudden, we don't like the cities because they're congested and they're dirty and we don't want to live in them. And we've got all this racial tension. I don't want to live around these people that aren't like me. And then we get a theological justification for why it's okay to move, because cities are intrinsically bad. That's what this theology started to tell us. And so all of a sudden, I've got a theological justification for why it's okay for me to get out to where my kids will be okay, where I can raise my kids in a godly home, where I can get them out of the squalor, so to speak, where I can get them out of evil, because cities are evil. About that time, we had our huge church planting push as evangelicals in the suburbs. And we thought we were extremely successful because we planted tons of churches in the suburbs. The 60s, 70s, 80s, churches were going up on every corner in the suburbs. We're catching up to a time when we all can remember, right? So here we are in the suburbs. There's a church on every corner, particularly in our southern cities. We thought we'd won the suburbs. Really, we'd all just moved out there and started our own churches. Did we reach new people? Or did we just open up spaces for all the evangelicals that were streaming out of the middle of the city? I'm afraid it was the latter. So we set up in the suburban ring around the city. Churches go up everywhere, and because we're suburban, we start doing church in a uniquely suburban way. 70s and the 80s, we start seeing the birth of megachurches. Church is no longer 100, 200, 300 people. It's 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people. And like everything else we wound up doing in the suburbs, because we've got the automobile, church was done by destination living. That's how we did work, right? We lived in our house, we'd commute 30 minutes to work. That's how we did entertainment. We lived at our house, we'd commute 30 minutes to a shopping mall. And we'd all get out of the car, and the kids would have stuff to go do, and the adults would have stuff to go do. And so we'd all go to a place where we could be entertained, and we'd drive to that joint. There'd be a food court inside of it, so it's this one-stop shop. It's destination living. That's the way we did everything else. And so we found a way to make church work that way. And churches started talking about being regional churches now. Oh, we've got a bigger area because we've got people driving 30 minutes to get here. People in the suburbs drive 30 minutes to get anywhere. So it just made sense for them to drive 30 minutes to church. But since they're driving 30 minutes to church, we need to make this location something that is a destination for them to come to. It's going to have a gym. It's going to have a weight room. It's going to have softball fields. It's going to have a food court. Some of them do. I know of a particular church outside of Memphis. They've got a retirement community next door to the church property so that you can visit your elderly family members on Sundays when you're there for church. It becomes the one-stop shop. Now, don't mishear me. I'm not saying that that's a bad way to do ministry. I'm just saying this is kind of how it developed. In fact, in that suburban setting, it was an effective way of doing it, clearly, because it was a success, right? It took off. They became stable. However, what it has done is it's rewired our way of thinking about how you do church. Church became a destination. That doesn't work in an urban setting. And it's one of the reasons it's been so hard for us ever since to really get back in and do anything in an urban setting with any effectiveness, because we are hardwired, at least us evangelicals that grew up doing church in the suburbs, we're kind of hardwired to think about it in a destination way. So we've got to be able to rethink some of that stuff. So that occurred. It spread us out. We had technological ways to get out from 1920 on. From 1950 on, there were emotional reasons to get out. There were cultural reasons to get out. And then there were even theological reasons to get out. And what it did is it caused us to set up a very culturally tied way of doing our ministry. It became very tied to that suburban setting. Final transition. Really, the 1990s, you start seeing hints of this, but it really full bore becomes a thing around 2000. The trends of suburbanization started to cool off. They started to slow down, and cities weren't losing people, and suburban areas weren't exploding around them, but instead, the trend seemed to kind of reverse, and more people started moving into cities. So all of a sudden, these inner city urban core areas that had been marked as poor, had been marked as minority, all of a sudden people are moving back into them. There's a lot of reasons why this trend occurs. One of them, I think one of the biggest ones, let me go ahead and say this. So in that trend, so 2000 on, there are two huge demographics of Americans at least that are moving back into U.S. cities, into the dense part of it. And they are millennials. That's the obvious one. Everybody knows that people 35 and under have got this infatuation all of a sudden with living in a city again. But the other is empty nesters. Oddly enough, baby boomers, by the droves, are moving back into city center. So hold that in your head as I talk through some of this stuff. Why would it be that that's happening? With that younger crowd, the reason, as far as I'm concerned, from what I've read, is a disenfranchisement with the suburbs. So the thing that we were promised, the American dream that happened out there in the suburbs, it never really happened, did it? We were looking for something that the gospel can provide, and we were looking for it in a city planning movement. We wanted community. We wanted to be able to move out of congestion and busy and dirty and whatever. We wanted to be able to move around people like us. And we thought that by doing so, we'd be able to find Mayberry. Mayberry doesn't exist. That's not a real place. That's right. It's fiction. And children, instead of experiencing the community the parents thought they were taking them to, grew up with fences around their yard and getting in and out of their car in a garage on their way back and forth to things. So they grew up in probably the most isolated period of American history. Interpersonally isolated, that is. People my age and younger don't like that. They're disenfranchised by that. They feel like there's no community out there. They feel like everything looks exactly like everything else. And man, if you drive through some of those neighborhoods, it does, doesn't it? You can't even find your own house because everybody's looks the same. That's the world that they wanted to leave. So there's this disenfranchisement in that generation that starts to push them back in because the American dream turns into sprawl. And instead of this nice little slice of American dream, what you really have is a 45-minute to hour commute in the morning and bumper-to-bumper traffic on the interstate to get to your job as an accountant in the middle of the city. Who wants that? Right? And so that has pushed toward people wanting to move back in. There's this felt thing that I can't find happiness here. Hear this. I can't find happiness here. So maybe if I change my location, happiness will be there waiting for me. That's what we did when we moved out of the city. So the high irony here is all these millennials, their parents did that exact thing, looking for happiness out in the suburbs. And these kids are growing up there going, man, happiness isn't here. Maybe it's in there. So that's this felt need. In addition to that, we finally got to a point where we can build a city in a sustainable way. At least we're a lot better at it now than we used to be. And so urban planners and designers and people of that nature are realizing it's actually cheaper, more economically sound, more environmentally sound for us to live in dense pockets. We can do green cities now. And so our energy footprint is lower when we do it this way. Everybody's not spending 3 gallons of gas one way to work every morning if they all live within walking distance of where they work. And so it becomes cheaper, more efficient, more economically sound. And so we've developed ways to do urban now that can create dense without some of the bad sides of the congestion and the unsafe circumstances and all of that stuff that was occurring. So we've now, again, had a technological advance that allows that move to take place back into the cities. What this means is gentrification. So if there are two things I want you to hear out of kind of where we are right now in this narrative of cities, there are two huge factors affecting our really dense urban core, or cores, because they don't just set up in city center anymore. You'll see them set up in places around city center now, these dense cores. But there's two things. One is gentrification, one's immigration. Let's talk gentrification right quick. So we have this felt need to move back into the cities because we're disenfranchised with the suburbs. Technology becomes available for us to do so. So the people that have financially got the means to do it, and the technology is now here, this creates gentrification. These people want to live inside. We've now found a way for them to do it. So we're going to turn this old neighborhood into a brand new neighborhood that instills all these ideals that these people are wanting to find in there. It's walkable. I'm going to live in an apartment complex where I'm going to see my neighbors. It's green. It's close. I can find community. So it instills all of those things. This is what is driving, in many instances, gentrification. Now, there's plethora of reasons. A big one's the commute. From city to city to city, different industries may make a impact on that. For instance, Nashville, Tennessee, a lot of it's the arts community that's doing it there. So different city may have a different economic reason for it happening. But you've got these other factors that all kind of meet together, and what is happening right now is a city revitalization movement across the country. And I call it city revitalization because that's on the surface what our cities are calling it. Because if you were a mayor and a city council, all that means for you is money, right? Maybe not in your pocket. I'm not saying they're corrupt. Some may be. But the point I'm making is that means revenue dollars flowing back into your city. All of a sudden, we've got middle class, upper class people that are wanting to live in high-rise apartment complexes back in the middle of our city. All of these businesses are going to open up around them. And as they do that, it's going to generate revenue for the city in a way where the city center has not had it in 40 years. So they love the idea. And we refer to it as revitalization. That's what our city is revitalizing right now. In addition, obviously your developers are going to love it. People stand to make untold millions off tearing down a neighborhood and putting in a high-rise apartment. Right? So there's reasons why this is really going to get pushed the way that it is. However, gentrification has two sides. It has two sides. One side is the fact that it is going to bring money back to the city. It's going to bring population back to the city. It's going to make the neighborhoods greener. It's going to make the neighborhoods more efficient. There are benefits. But the downside is called displacement. And so for every house you tear down to put up a Chipotle, you have to kick a family out. And that's happening across the country right now. And so you have got situations where these two issues land right next to each other. And depending on where you live on that cultural divide, you love that it's happening, you hate that it's happening, right? It's causing tension, and I don't think most of the people on the revitalization side know that it's causing tension, if that makes sense. But displacement is occurring across the country in urban centers all over the place. I did a lot of my boots on the ground research in D.C. I lived in a neighborhood in D.C. that was in the northwest quadrant. It was a few blocks from the White House. But it was close to a historically black neighborhood called Shaw. And I lived right on the line where gentrification was sweeping through. So you go one street over, it was still fairly poor African American, primarily because it's a historically black neighborhood, Old Town Shaw. You go one this way, and it was tech startups, it was townhouses that had been completely renovated, and they had young millennial families that worked, at the Senate or places like that living in them. And it was fascinating to me because I was up there researching this phenomenon. If I walked toward the gentrified neighborhood, the view of the city was completely optimistic. Oh, look at all the good things that are happening around here. This place is getting better and better. We're so happy about it. If I walked one block over the other direction, it was a virus that was eating away their town. And if you're the landlord that lives on that line, you're excited about it because all of a sudden I can kick out my my inhabitants that are paying $1,000 a month and bump that rent up to $3,000 a month. Why in the world would I not want to do that? And so it's creating these tensions inside the city right now. But now let's go back to what we mean by urban. Is urban black? No. Is urban gentrifying yuppies? No. It's both. And it's even more than that, because the other issue that we've got to deal with is immigration. Immigration. So if around 1900 we had the first great wave of immigration, and it was basically everybody that could come from Europe came. In the 60s, 70s, legislation changed on immigration here in the United States again. And when that, 60, that's exactly when it happened. When that legislation shifted, it opened the gates for immigration from countries that had never had that opportunity. And so we've hit what's known as the second great wave of immigration, which has brought more people than the first. It's a bigger wave. But this time, it's basically everybody except Europeans that are coming. There are so many of them from the 1040 window. It's China, it's India, it's the Middle East, it's sub-Saharan Africa. These people are coming in the droves now. And of course, you guys know that Central and South America, we've got a lot of people moving up from that direction as well. And so now, this is no longer a black-white paradigm around here. That is not the situation we live in anymore. It's every color you could possibly imagine now. And it's not just color, it's culture, folks. That's the big trick here. The cultures are different. The religions are different. The worldviews are different. What it is and isn't okay to do to another human is different, right? And so all of a sudden, the diversity that is created by this shift it's a game changer in how we're going to think through urban. Now, I will tell you, so here's where it gets even more complicated. With gentrification occurring, how the prices are going higher in the urban core, which means the people that live there are getting displaced, but it also means a lot of our immigrant communities that were initially settling in cities are now shifting to suburbs. Your suburbs are now getting ethnically diverse. You're going to start seeing little Indian markets crop up everywhere. You're going to start seeing a Thai massage parlor crop up. You're going to see nail salons. You're going to see a West African hair braiding shop. You're going to see things like this cropping up in strip malls that are out in the suburbs, right? And out there, they find a way to become an enclave. See, in the city where it's dense and it's packed and I don't really get to choose who my neighbor is, when you spread out a bit into the suburb, they're in a position where they can get together with a bunch of their buddies and they can buy a cul-de-sac. In the town where I live, there is a cul-de-sac in one of the neighborhoods just north, kind of in the little suburban ring. I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina, by the way. The entire cul-de-sac, which has 10 houses on it, are owned by about 4 different Turkish families. The entire cul-de-sac. They've created their own mini village. And they hang out with each other. I imagine they pray to Allah in their basement, in one of their basements probably. They've set up their own little society. So these enclaves are able to happen in the suburbs in a way that they're not able to happen in an urban core. So you see how like this is all cycling around each other now. So the urban core and the suburban rings transition in and out of each other over and over now. And so there's this cycle that's happening where diversity is pushing out into the suburbs. The suburbs are now getting whiter again. And it's pushing more diversity out into the suburbs. And these cultures are starting to affect each other. So they're tied together in a really complicated way now. This is kind of where we are. So what does urban look like? That's where this all leads, right? With all of the transition that has occurred. So you see how we've been in, we've been out, we're back in. With all this transition, we need to think through what does it actually mean to have a dense and diverse area that we have to minister to. What does it look like? This is how most people think of a city. If I say Nashville, Tennessee to you, that's where I was born in that area. If I say Nashville, Tennessee to you, does Nashville have a flavor in your head? Do you envision like a cowboy hat and a big belt buckle and a guitar, right? That's what most people envision. And exactly right. Nashville is now home to the largest population segment of Kurdish peoples on the planet outside of the Middle East. There's 15 to 20,000 of them there. They don't wear big belt buckles, right? And they have absolutely nothing to do with Nashville's cultural narrative. At least not the one that you know, and the one I know, and the one that Hollywood has told us about, right? We think of cities this way. We want to say they have a story. We want to say they have a culture. And this is where it starts becoming really important for us when it comes to ministry. When you are a young, ambitious church planter, or you are a young, ambitious pastor, and you say to yourself, I'm going to go reach Houston, you start trying to find out what Houston's story is and what Houston's culture is. But it doesn't have one. It has thousands. Thousands. There are 350 plus people groups here, if I'm not mistaken. I have no idea how many different language groups, religions I've never even heard of, and I'm a missiologist at the seminary, right? There are different economic segments. There are different cultural enclaves. Your city doesn't look like this. Nobody's city does. It looks like this. This is how cities look. And so when we have to start considering, how do we minister to an urban area? We've got to stop thinking, oh, if I can just get to the heartbeat of the way Houston thinks. Because Houston's got hundreds of heartbeats. And our task is not to reach some. Our task is to reach all. Right? It gets even more complicated. Let's turn that graphic on its side. It has depth. Right? And so all of a sudden, when you think through how people density creates people diversity, and this area starts crafting culture, this is what winds up happening. If I go back, this one's a little easier to play with. Some of these touch each other, right? There's going to be some overlap. So let's say this is our English-speaking crew here, and let's say this is our Spanish-speaking crew here. I, as an English speaker, may work with somebody that's a Spanish speaker, right? So we may have some overlap, but the communities themselves all have centers, and you're going to have people that have very little overlap. You're going to have ways of doing things. You're going to have cultural manifestations. What winds up happening in cities become a network of overlapping social circles. I'm going to say that one again. Cities become a network of overlapping social circles. Some people exist in one or two. Some people exist in three or four. But there are a whole lot of people that have very little contact with any circle except their own. Think about yourself right now. On day in, day out, going to work, going to church, going to fill in the blank hobbies, whatever you're doing. I'm assuming the majority of people you deal with are rather like you. The majority. This is just the way that folks function. This is the way people function. And so we've got to take that into consideration. We've got to realize that because it absolutely affects the way that we're going to be able to reach people. Let me move forward. I've got another slide. I'll show you guys here in a second about that. And this issue is another one that we've got to concern ourselves with. That's not an egg. That's a city. That blue center, think of it as the dense core. And like I said earlier, cities are more complicated even than this now. It's not just a dense core with a big suburb around it. It's actually a dense core with little cores that start to develop around in the suburban rings. Because suburbs are now starting to have urban centers in some of them, right? Think of the Galleria area here. So that winds up being an urban area, but it's not really in the city center, is it? So it's more complicated even than this. But you have an interplay between the city and the suburb around it because people move back and forth, right? Right now, we have all of these millennials that are wanting to move into the city. So they're headed into that core. But you're displacing people. And those people are moving out of that core, right? And so your suburbs are in a constant state of transition. Your urban core, constant state of transition. And they cycle around each other. This means their cultures are rubbing against each other's shoulders too. If you do a lot of reading on city and how you reach cities and things like that, there's a lot of books that are starting to get written on this topic at this point. A lot of them don't have this view. And I think they're wrong on this particular point. But they think of it as a kind of a one-way street where the city is this engine of culture. And everything just kind of flows out from the city, and the people in the suburbs just take whatever the city gives them. And then the people in rural areas just take the scraps that are left over from the suburbs, I guess. I don't really know how that works. But that view is a one-way street with culture. That's not how it works. You guys who live in a city that's got as much sprawl as you do will understand that. The areas around your city, the woodlands and different areas like that, they have cultures of their own. And that culture, because a lot of those people work in city center, it affects it. And all of these people that are streaming back into these gentrified areas right now, they're coming out of suburbs. They're taking their culture with them when they do that. It will shape the city of tomorrow. Vice versa. All those people that are getting displaced, all those immigrants that were landing in urban core 15 years ago, but are now landing in the suburbs, that's definitely going to affect the culture out there. So a city and its suburbs have a dialogical, it's a big fancy word that says they speak to each other, a dialogical relationship with one another. The city center informs the suburbs about culture, about matters of politics, about everything else, but the suburbs inform the city. The city center, the way that we do city here in the States, can't exist without its suburbs now. Think of what would happen to that city center's business core if the suburbs were gone. They're totally dependent upon each other at this point. And so they create a system that's really hard to pick out, well, this is urban and this is not urban. That's not really the helpful way to view urban for us right now. And I think a lot of people in mission circles are trying to do that. They're trying to click a box on this is an urban area, this is not an urban area. That's too hard to do. What we need to realize is that it's a complicated web of social circles. And we need to stop trying to put them in boxes and instead send people into the area and go, what does this area look like? What are the social circles that are here? And what do we need to do to share the gospel with them adequately in a way that makes sense to them? Contextualization, right? So that's what we start talking about there. What is our mission then? If that's what we need to be doing, if this is the way the cities look, what is our mission? Here is a basic proposition that I want to throw out to you. I think, at least for the last 15, 20 years, it's starting to shift, and I'm thankful for this. We, in evangelicalism, for the most part, have been trying to be urban ministers from a suburban location. Now, what do I mean by this? We're trying to do ministry from the outside. If you look across the country at most of our urban centers, the vast majority of evangelical churches are sitting outside the perimeter and in the suburbs. We talked earlier about the suburban church planting boom that happened. We've got churches on every corner in a lot of suburban areas. Even cities like DC that have got very few churches, period, almost all the churches are concentrated outside the district itself. They're all in that suburban ring. So that's kind of where they exist. Now, we say urban is important for us. We hear stats about how more people live in cities than outside of cities at this point. And so urban's becoming a fad in evangelical circles. But we're wanting to be able to do it from our house in the suburbs. And that will inevitably lead to ministry that is programmed, periodic, or outsourced. Those are really your only three options. If you live outside the city and you want to do ministry in the city, you're going to have to set up an event to do it probably. Let's load up a bunch of people in this church van and let's head into the city and let's do fill in the blank. Let's go paint a house. Let's go do a vacation Bible school for some kids in an apartment complex. Let's do whatever, right? It becomes programmed. Periodic, that's the nature of it too. You don't live in there. And so ministry is not a day in, day out thing for you. It's a thing that you do every Thursday at 7, right? And then outsourced. What I mean by outsourced is this reality that, well, We can't be in there if we're out here. And so what we're going to need are nonprofit organizations or some kind of mission that we set up. And so we go in and we have charities that we send money to. And so we outsource the ministry. Instead of the church doing it, we pay somebody else to go in there and do it for us. Now, don't mishear me. Some of those ministries are vital, they're important, and they do good work. But we don't need to outsource the Great Commission. Right? That's not a thing we can outsource as a church. So, this leads to one of two strategies: parachute ministries and parachurch ministries. This is what we have been primarily doing, and this is what we've got to change. Parachute. So what we do is we hop in and we parachute some people in for a little while and then we extract them. Or parachurch. We set up an organization that'll go in and take care of that soup kitchen for us. Right? And we feel like we're doing some urban ministry that way. Obviously, neither of these are ideal. What we need is urban ministry done by urban ministers. Novel concept, huh? Here's a better way. Effective urban ministry, this is kind of my go-to phrase, consists of churches in the city, made up of residents of the city, bearing witness for the city to the glory of God. That's what we need to do. Churches in the city. But they're made up of residents that are of the city, right? And they're in a position to be able to bear witness to the gospel of the kingdom, word and deed, right? They can take care of the same stuff that soup kitchen is taking care of because they now live in there. They're doing social ministry. They're taking care of needs in the city. They're loving their neighbor. But they're also sharing the gospel. And they're demonstrating the community of the Lord Jesus Christ by being right there. And so they are showing what so many of these millennials are moving back in looking for, right? They're looking for a sense of community. Now, quickly, I'm going to try to run through these with you. This kind of ministry must be, in my estimation, 4 things. It must be church-based. It must be context-sensitive. It must be cooperative. And it must be multi-layered. Let's run through that right quick. Church-based. I'm going to start with the Great Commission. I think it's a pretty good place to start when we start talking about a theology of what we need to do in the cities, right? So our job, according to the Great Commission, is to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them, and this part gets left out all the time, teaching them to obey all that has been commanded. That's discipleship. This is not just saying evangelize people. This is saying you teach them how to love their neighbor. You teach them how to take care of the poor, the sick, the infirm, the elderly. You teach them how to be a community, to do the one another commands. You teach them what has been commanded. And then there's this. What have they been commanded? You can sum it up pretty well in the Great Commandment, can't you? Right? To love your neighbor as yourself. This is all rudimentary. You guys are pastors, you're ministry leaders, you understand our job is Great Commission, Great Commandment, right? But what does that look like in a city? The church's mission is to bear witness to the gospel of the kingdom through word and deed in every corner of the globe. Our cities are that area we skip over on our way to Africa, if we're not careful. You're right about that. We need to make sure we realize that's a corner of the globe. And it's so complicated we don't want to get into the middle of it. But it has got to be a church-based mission. I cannot underscore this point enough. The reason for the last 40, 50 years we've had a lessening impact in cities is because we've been trying to do it through parachurch organizations. They're good, but they're not enough. The church is the vehicle for accomplishing the above mission. That's not me, that's God. He put that in the Bible, right? Matthew 16, 18 through 19. Let me just read these scriptures to you right quick. Give me just a second to pull them up. And us talk about the primacy of the church in the middle of this. We can't lose the church in this mission. It is so central. So Matthew 16, 18 and 19 says this, I tell you, you're Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And what does he say about the church? the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Is it going to be successful? Yes. The church wins because Christ wins. And we're in the church, and all authority has been given to Christ. And who does He give it to accomplish His mission? He doesn't give it to parachurch organizations. I work at one. I work at a seminary, right? We exist, though, to help the church do the church's mission, right? That's who that authority has been given to. And then it goes on to say this, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. I have no idea what that means. But it does mean this. What we as a church do now matters. Right? What we bind now is already bound, or will be bound in heaven, is the way the Greek actually renders there. Will be bound in heaven. What we do now has eternal consequences. Amen. Right? Right? Now let's look at the next one right here real quick. Ephesians 3:10. Ephesians 3:10. Paul here is speaking to Ephesians about the gospel, that central mission that he's given them. And he says this, I'm going to read a little more than 3:10. He says, of this gospel I was made a minister according to the gift of God's grace, which was given to me by the working of His power. To me, though, I am the very least of all the saints. This grace was given, here it is, to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ, and to bring to light for everyone what is the plan of the mystery hidden for ages in God, who created all things. That's some big stuff. To create, or to make known that plan, right? But look what he says. He says, so that through the church, the manifold wisdom of God might be made known to rulers and authorities. It's through the church that this mission is done. And the church universal can only accomplish it through the church local, right? We have to have local churches. We need churches in the city, like I said earlier, made up of residents of the city. Church planting is holistic ministry, folks. It is, if we understand that a church is supposed to go in there and do word and deed ministry. A local gospel witness and a local vehicle for love and mercy. Our goal is not social transformation. We need to be careful about that one. Our goal is to go in and provide faithful presence. We don't need to get... Christ is the one that comes back and restores all of creation, right? Our goal is to go in there and bear witness to what He's doing. Our goal is to go in there and help. Our goal is to go in there and do ministry and love. Yeah. But we don't need to try to... We can't... Like, Christ is the one that fixes culture, not us. So we need to be careful about that. 2 ways to do this. We move in and plant some churches. And we raise up people from the inside to plant their own churches. Right? Takes advantage of natural migration. If we move our own people in, and it moves our churches from a mindset of addition to multiplication. And then we raise up people from the inside. This is where indigeneity comes from. This is where we have churches that are in those social circles. They're in those cultures that can reach them and communicate to them in a way that we necessarily can't. This is going to take discovery that leads to engagement. We need to be able to go in, see what the city looks like, and engage it. Hopefully, as we do that, we'll see this kind of thing right here start to happen. Right? Churches that start to develop in various places in these social circles. But if we know what the city looks like, then we're able to understand where we need churches, and we can start reaching into those areas in a way that we can plant those churches. It's a cooperative effort. Suburban churches have a role to play in this. Their role is helping train and equip people to understand why they're moving in the first place. They may think it's for a job. They may think it's for a new way of doing life. But it's something more significant than that. No single church has the resources to reach its city. Amen. You guys just saw how that worked. You saw how all the social circles were. No church has the resources to reach its whole city. There's too many different kinds of people. There's too many cultural narratives. However, if the churches in a city cooperate, they have all they need to do it together. What we need are churches that are willing to partner with each other. Suburban churches to realize the best means for them to do urban ministry, teach, train, and equip people that are moving back in, develop a partnership with some of those churches that are inside the city already. Send your people off to them so that they can be trained in the context. Send them in knowing why they're going in. Let that church that's in there teach them what it's like to be in there so that they can go plant another church. And if we can create pipelines to do that kind of work, we can actually create an effective strategy that works in any city. Because what it's doing is it's taking a real look at the city and saying these are the things we need, and then it's using people from the city to do the ministry. Right? So that's hopefully something that we can move toward. All right, I'm done.